golden age of radio, the rise of trade unions, the development of transatlantic flight, and the discovery of penicillin during their formative years. Silents tended to marry and have children young, and their attitude of taking no chances would become criticized by future, more radical generations, such as baby boomers. Finally we talk about the boomers. Possibly the most famous modern birth generation and one of the most active time periods in American history, the boomers of the 40s, 50s, and 60s were known for their ridiculously high birth rates. With 76 million births taking place during this time period, this was due to a strong post-war economy in which Americans felt confident they would be able to support a large number of children. Boomers influenced the economy as a core marketing demographic for products tied to their age group, from toys to records. On top of this, many items previously deemed luxurious, such as laundry machines, the dishwasher, the refrigerator, and the telephone, entered mass production for the average consumer, and the average American could live like the upper class from the previous generation. Technological advances made before, during, and after the war, such as plastics, television, magnetic tape, transistors, integrated circuits, and lasers, played a key role in the tremendous improvements in the typical standard of living. With this extended period of optimism came a cultural rush, especially in the music industry, where the Beatles, Bob Dylan, the Rolling Stones, and many other artists and bands all became extremely popular. Not everything was sunshine and rainbows, of course, as it was the time period where major political discussion around topics like the sexual revolution, civil rights, nuclear weaponry, ethnocultural diversity, and environmental protection all became popular and heavily debated. This was because this generation was a lot more radical. Many people during this time had different perspectives, and a lot of them favored more left-leaning social causes in almost every direction, strongly opposing existing conservative traditionalist thinking that plenty of others still had. Many of these major political disagreements resulted in protests that were becoming increasingly violent, especially as the Vietnam War lingered on and on. The United States would slowly become more divided, and government distrust would rise in the following generations. Generation X. This generation is often called the latchkey generation, which stems from the children of this generation returning from school to an empty home and needing to use a door key to let themselves in, as a result of living in an era of a lot of free-range parenting, increasing divorce rates, increased maternal participation in the workforce, and widespread availability of childcare options outside the home. Young adults of this time period were dubbed the MTV generation, sometimes characterized as slackers, cynical, and disaffected. The baby boom era of the last generation was met with declining birth rates during this generation, partially due to the birth control bill being introduced in 1960 and abortion being legalized in 1973. However, demographic changes brought by the 1965 Immigration Act partially offset the declining birth rates from Americans already living there, and contributed to making Gen X in America more culturally and ethnically diverse than America had ever been. Gen X music saw many alternative rock, hip-hop, punk, post-punk, and heavy metal bands rise in popularity. Technological innovation boomed during this time period, with the rise of home computing from manufacturers like Apple, Commodore, and Atari taking to the scene with their offerings. Video games became a booming industry during the 1970s and 1980s, with arcades becoming widely successful across the country, and Nintendo and Atari introducing home consoles. Compared to boomers, Gen Xers were far more educated as enrollment in college was way more popular. Individualism and entrepreneurialism became one of the most defining traits booming industry during the 1970s and 1980s, with arcades becoming widely successful across the country.
The Nintendo 8-bit.
And Nintendo and Atari introducing home consoles. Compared to boomers.
What? They did not introduce it in 1980? When did 8-bit actually release? Yeah, 1986 in Europe, 1985 in the US, 83 in Japan. So that's not part of this.
Gen Xers were far more educated as enrollment in college was way more popular. Individualism and entrepreneurialism became one of the most defining traits with Gen X, as the collective generation would go on to produce Google, Wikipedia, Amazon, and YouTube towards the 90s and early 2000s. Generation Y. Millennials. Millennials were the first generation to grow up with the internet, mobile technology, and social media.
Are they just talking about... it's kind of confusing when they're talking about... Like, who is he talking about? Are they talking about the teenagers of this generation? Are they talking about the kids of this generation?
They are commonly described as the first global generation, being connected to the entire world. However, they are also described as the unluckiest generation, due to their average and slower economic growth since entering the workforce than any other generation in history, as well as them being weighed down by student debt and child care costs. Millennials were born at a time of declining fertility rates around the world, and are having fewer children than their predecessors. Young people of the 2010s were often criticized for having less sexual intercourse compared to their predecessors when they were the same age. In 2010, the unemployment rate in the United States reached a record low at 19%, and these These economic difficulties have led to a dramatic increase in youth poverty, unemployment, and a large number of them living with their parents. Millennials are also less likely to be religious than their predecessors, though many identify as spiritual. Millennials experienced 9/11, which changed American culture and began the war on terrorism. That's not to say it's all bad for them, however, as they are often characterized for their digital fluency, diverse perspectives, and a strong sense of social consciousness, due to them being born in a time period where global news and information can be retrieved in seconds. Millennials are very active socially and politically, and not afraid to use their voice. And despite the previously mentioned economic troubles they face, more than 8 in 10 feel confident in their finances, which is representative of their generally positive outlook in a more complicated world. Generation Z, Zoomers. Zoomers are not that much different from millennials, but there are some key differences. While millennials were exposed to the internet and smartphones during their formative years and witnessed the entire world change, being forced to adapt to it too quickly, Zoomers were born into it. People born during this time period have grown up with the rise of social justice movements, a vicious new form of American politics with the rise of Donald Trump, the Black Lives Matter protests, a new pandemic, and lockdowns that prevented most of them from experiencing a large part of their high school or college lives. On top of that, there's an ever-growing attention and dopamine economy with apps like YouTube and more recently TikTok transforming not just how information is consumed, but their algorithms also transforming what information is sent out to the public. Even something as simple and stupid as memes, which were started by millennials as jokes, have become tools to spread and popularize ideas. Individualism defines the Zoomer spirit, as they have once again returned to the entrepreneurial spirit of Gen X because of the internet. And freelancing and gig economy work is transforming how jobs are run, while the pandemic transformed where jobs are run, at home rather than in office. Social media trends influence culture in a much different way than before, because individuals are now just as capable of getting attention as traditional media and the financially backed entertainment industry, leading to jobs like social media content creation and influencers being the most wanted job, above traditional work. Zoomers also grew up with SpongeBob, which defined culture more than really anything else in the last century. Generation Alpha. Not much is known about what will happen to Gen Alpha, who is currently being raised mostly by millennials, as it's hard to predict what the future will bring. Described by some as the pandemic generation, they experienced everything about the pandemic as young children, and are growing up in a world dominated by changes in their education and entertainment due to technology. Many talk about the pandemic of iPad
I'll tell you
as this
what they're
generation
gonna
spends less
face.
time with their parents
They
on
can't
average than
fucking
previous
read
generations,
in
instead living
fucking
independently and
second
self-directed,
grade.
growing up
These
with a now
fucking
20-year-old
kids.
version
They're
of the
literally
internet.
worse
Many will
than
experience young adulthood in their
Zoomers,
2030s, and are expected by the United Nations to have an average lifespan of 83 years across the world. Problems that they are predicted to face are mental health issues, misinformation, and polarization, but it's hard to tell what the future will bring for them.
They are the most fucked fucking millennial parents, man.